Welcome, dreamer. Tonight, we follow the tide to a bell that rings just once. At the edge of the world, where silence listens. In a coastal town wrapped in whispers, where fog crept across the streets like silk unraveling from a ghost's sleeve, there stood a peculiar little shop tucked into a crooked alley. The buildings on either side leaned slightly inward, like old friends who had grown weary from watching the waves. One was made of smooth sea-worn stone, the other of painted wood that peeled in long, curling ribbons. The shop itself had no sign. No name. No business hours. Only a door, painted the color of smoke, and a single bell above it shaped like a teardrop. It did not ring when people passed. It rang only when the breeze carried a question. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of lavender gone to sleep, dried bundles hung from the rafters, swaying ever so slightly even when no one walked beneath them. Light filtered in like a whisper, casting long shadows that moved as if they dreamed on their own. There were shelves upon shelves of strange things, bottles filled with echoes, moth-wing bookmarks pressed between forgotten pages, stones that whispered lullabies when warmed by hand. Beneath a tall, arching window of sea glass sat a single mirror. It was tall and narrow, framed in tarnished silver. The edges were etched with soft swirling lines, and scattered across its surface were delicate moths, not painted, nor carved, but somehow alive, frozen mid-flight in patterns that shimmered under moonlight. The townsfolk had long grown used to the shop's oddness, and most walked past it without so much as a second glance. They said the place had belonged to someone named Serafini, though no one had seen her in years. They said the mirror had once belonged to a traveling dream merchant, though that too was only a whisper. But there was one who noticed. A girl who paused, always, at the window when the fog grew thick and the light dimmed to pearl. Her name was Liz. She was not loud, nor particularly curious by nature. But something in her, something quiet and searching, felt drawn to the mirror the way moss reaches for stone. Each time she passed the shop, she would stop. Just for a moment. Just long enough for the fog to curl around her like a sigh. Just long enough to feel that maybe, the mirror was looking back. And on the day our story truly begins, a soft, silvery morning when the seagulls were still asleep and the world seemed to hold its breath, the mirror blinked. Not a shimmer. Not a flicker. A blink. As if something behind it had just woken up. The moth and the mirror. Liz returned the next day, though she hadn't meant to. She told herself she was only taking the long way home, only wandering through the fog for the way it softened the world. But her feet knew the truth. They carried her gently, without hurry, back to the little shop between the leaning houses. This time, the door was open. Not wide, just a crack, as if someone had left in haste, or hoped a breeze might slip through unnoticed. The bell above the door gave no sound as she stepped inside. Only the hush of her breath and the soft shuffle of her boots against old wooden floors filled the space. It felt warmer inside than she remembered, though a chill still clung to the corners. The mirror stood where it always had, but today, it seemed different. Its surface no longer showed the room behind her. Instead, it shimmered faintly, like the surface of a still pond touched by a falling petal. And the moths along its frame seemed to shift ever so slightly, their wings curled in patterns that had not been there the day before. Liz stepped closer. For a moment, she thought she saw something on the other side. Not her own reflection. Not the room. But a garden, a dreamlike space glowing with silver light and petal-shaped lanterns that floated in the air like drifting fireflies. Trees twisted like poems and a soft breeze stirred 1,000 silent chimes. And there, resting on the branch of a tree that looked as if it had been painted in moonlight, was a moth. It was large, not frighteningly so, but larger than any moth she'd ever seen. Its wings were soft, covered in downy dust, and shimmered with gentle hues that shifted like thoughts just before sleep. Pale blue. Gentle violet. A gold too tired to shine. The moth turned its head and looked at her. Liz did not speak. Her voice felt like it belonged somewhere else. She simply placed her palm gently against the mirror's surface. It was warm. The moth opened its wings. And though she stood in the dusty, lavender-scented shop, Liz felt something stir inside her, as if her very soul had leaned forward. She stayed there for a long time, the light dimming, the fog thickening outside. Then, quietly, she whispered, "Hello." The mirror did not answer. But the moth did not disappear. On the third evening, just after the last fairy horn had cried across the sea and the scent of salt grew faint on the wind, Liz found herself at the shop again. The door was closed now, but the fog held the warmth of the day like a woolen shawl, and the windows glowed faintly from within, not with firelight, but with something softer, older. She stepped inside. Nothing had moved. The same dried herbs swayed from the rafters, the same quiet dust curled through the golden air, and the same hush held the room like a breath not yet let go. Only the mirror had changed. Tonight, its surface was no longer still. The garden beyond was clearer, as though the glass had thinned, and Liz could see its many paths, winding, looping, leading nowhere and everywhere. The grass in that place did not grow from soil but from mist itself, and flowers opened with a sound like pages turning. And the lanterns, oh, the lanterns, floated gently above it all, shaped like moths and stars and the tears of clouds. They glowed from within, lit not by fire, but by memory. The moth was waiting. It sat now on a small bridge of woven branches that arched over a stream made of light. When Liz stepped close, it tilted its wings slightly, as if to acknowledge her presence. Again, she raised her hand, brushing the cool surface of the mirror, hoping for something, anything, that would tell her she wasn't imagining it all. And then, something shifted. A shimmer passed through her, like a sigh from the past, and for the briefest moment, the scent of violets filled her lungs, not the dried kind from the rafters, but fresh ones. Alive. Drenched in dew. A single whisper tickled the edges of her thoughts. Not in words, but in meaning. Come. She staggered back, blinking. Was it the moth? The mirror? Her own wishful heart? But even as she turned to leave, her gaze lingered on the glass, and she knew, deep down, where dreams nest like doves in a loft, that something was waiting for her. The next day, she would return with a question in her heart. And perhaps, this time, the mirror would answer. The morning came quietly, as all mornings do in towns stitched together by sea fog and time-worn memory. The sky wore a shawl of pale gray, and the waves whispered secrets to the shore. Liz sat on her windowsill, wrapped in a quilt the color of old tea leaves. In her lap rested a leather-bound journal, untouched for many seasons. She had never known quite what to write in it. Her days were gentle but ordinary, soft pieces of time that rarely asked to be remembered. But now, she had the mirror. And the moth. She opened the journal and wrote 3 simple words. "What is your name?" That evening, she walked to the shop again. The bell did not ring. The air inside was warm, not with heat, but with presence, as if the shop itself remembered her now, and chose to open its arms. The mirror glowed, pale and steady. The garden beyond it seemed closer than ever, as though it had leaned forward too. The bridge still curved over the stream of light, but now there was a small table beside it. A table made of folded branches and moss, upon which sat an open book, glowing faintly. And there, in the garden's hush, the moth waited again. Liz stepped close, journal clutched in both hands. She lifted it, as if to show the mirror, then flipped to the page and whispered, "What is your name?" For a moment, all was still. Then, from within the mirror, a soft pulse of light shimmered out, once, twice, thrice. In her journal, the ink she had written with began to fade, not vanish, but change. The words she had written trembled, and slowly, new letters unfurled beneath them, shaped in curling strokes as delicate as moth wings. "They call me Oren." Liz stared. Her breath caught like a thread on a splinter. It had answered. Not with sound. Not with speech. But with something older than language. She traced the name gently with her fingertip, afraid that too much motion might erase it. Oren. The moth in the mirror turned its wings, revealing a spiral of soft gold beneath the violet. It felt like a bow. A greeting. And Liz, quiet and wondering, bowed her head in return. For the first time in all her silent days, she had met someone who did not exist in the world she knew. And yet, it felt more real than anything else. The mirror had begun to change. Each time Liz returned to the shop, it seemed less like a mirror and more like a doorway left slightly ajar. The air near it hummed faintly now, like the soft purring of a drowsy cat. And sometimes, when she walked past without entering, the mirror glowed ever so slightly brighter, as if calling her back. She never stayed away for long. On the 5th night, she brought a candle. Not because she needed it, there was always enough light, but because it felt right. She placed it on the floor before the mirror, lit it with care, and sat cross-legged, her journal open beside her. Inside the mirror, Oren waited by the stream of light. A folded shape hung from a nearby tree, like parchment caught in ivy. As Liz leaned in, she saw that it was a map, not of places, but of feelings. Soft trails drawn in color, not ink. A swirl of blue that smelled like her grandmother's garden in early spring. A curl of warm gray that reminded her of lullabies sung into the crook of a shoulder. A path of violet that held the hush of snowfall when no one is watching. She could not read it, not in the usual way. But she felt it. Each path drawn on that map was made of memory, stitched together from tenderness and silence. Oren fluttered beside it, wings catching starlight. With one gentle motion, the moth traced a path from the violet curl to a pale golden dot near the edge of the page. And Lys understood. It was an invitation. That night, back in her room, she dreamed of walking that path, not in a body of skin and bone, but in a form made of hush and hope. She followed the trail through a forest of bells, beneath a sky stitched with dreams, until she reached a clearing filled with glowing threads. Each thread hummed softly, and when she touched one, it sang the sound of her first laugh, echoing in her father's arms. She woke with tears on her cheeks. Not sorrow. Not joy. Just remembering. On the sixth night, when the stars lingered long above the sea and the tide hummed lullabies to the shore, Lys wrapped herself in her grandmother's shawl, the one that smelled faintly of cinnamon and old rain, and crept into the shop. She had not told anyone. The mirror had become her secret, her silent companion, and she felt that speaking of it aloud might scatter it like mist beneath a harsh sun. The shop was quieter than usual. Even the clock by the window had stopped ticking, as if time itself waited, breath held. Lys approached the mirror slowly. Its surface no longer showed her pale face or the hanging tapestries behind her. Instead, it shimmered with a soft glow, like moonlight seen through fog. And within it, the garden waited. It was a strange garden, not strange in shape, but in feeling. The trees had no leaves, yet they glowed with sleepy light. The grass curled in gentle spirals, as though it grew not toward the sky, but toward dreams. And in the air, little lanterns floated, shaped like moths, glowing from within, drifting softly through the air. The moth was there again, perched upon a flower made entirely of glass dew. It turned its delicate wings, slowly, like pages turning in a forgotten book. Then it looked at her. And for the first time, Lys saw it truly. Its wings bore her memories. One side shimmered with the light of her father's old workshop, the wood shavings, the humming of lullabies as he carved. The other side showed her mother's laughter, the kind that came during warm rain, when puddles became kingdoms and spoons became ships. She touched the mirror. And for just a moment, she wasn't in the shop at all. She was standing barefoot in that glowing garden, the scent of moon dust and violets all around, the moth alighting gently on her shoulder like a forgotten thought come home. Then, in the blink of an eye, she was back. But her heart remembered. The seventh evening came with a stillness that even the seagulls respected. No cries echoed over the tide. No shutters clattered. The village seemed wrapped in velvet silence, as if the world itself waited for the next turn in a dream. Lys walked slowly through the fog, her shawl wrapped tightly around her, her breath soft as moth wings. The candle in her hand flickered gently, casting golden halos onto the cobblestones. The shop welcomed her as it always did, not with words, but with presence. She stepped inside, the hush of the space greeting her like an old friend. The mirror's light was softer now, not dimmed, but folded in, like a lantern cupped in two gentle palms. Oren was already there. But something was new. Beside the bridge of branches, where the moth so often waited, there now rested a book. It shimmered faintly, bound in threads of silver mist, with no title to name it. Its pages, when Lys looked closely, were blank. She stared, heart fluttering like wings. Oren drifted beside the book, gently alighting on its cover. Then, ever so slowly, the moth opened its wings, and as it did, faint lines began to bloom upon the first page. Not words, but moments. The sound of warm rain on a windowpane. The smell of cinnamon rising from her grandmother's kitchen. The feeling of waking from a bad dream to a lullaby humming through the floorboards. Each page turned itself, and with every turn, more memories unfolded, not all from Lys, but from others. Soft, nameless souls who had once stood before the mirror. Their joys. Their quiet sorrows. Their hopes folded into starlight. And as she watched, Lys felt something stir within her, a longing not for adventure or answers, but for understanding. She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, her own hands were resting upon the book's cover. And in the margin of one glowing page, a single line had appeared. To remember is to return. She did not know what it meant. But it felt right. It was on the 8th night that the fog came thickest, so dense it curled around chimneys and rested in baskets on doorsteps. Lanterns along the street flickered uncertainly, and the scent of sea roses drifted where it pleased. Lys nearly turned back. But something pulled her forward, not urgency, not fear, but the feeling one has when a story is almost ready to speak. When she reached the shop, the door was already open. Inside, the mirror glowed gently, but the garden beyond it had changed. Tonight, it was twilight there, too, not the sharp kind that cuts the edges of the world, but the velvet kind that smooths all things into dream. Oren did not greet her from the bridge, nor wait by the flower of glass. Instead, the moth hovered beside a willow that shimmered with pale threads. From its boughs hung small, glowing orbs, and within each one drifted a seam, soft and half-formed, like forgotten thoughts. As Lys stepped closer, one of the threads lowered, and the orb brushed her fingertips. She saw herself, small, in her childhood bed, curled beneath a sky-blue blanket. A storm raged outside. Lightning danced in the window. But beside her sat her mother, quiet and firm, reading a story about stars who wished they could dream. Lys had forgotten that night. But the mirror had not. The orb drifted upward again, and another lowered, this one filled with light and laughter, the warm chaos of a birthday in the garden, cake crumbling in fingers, music playing from an old wind-up box. Each orb held something unsaid. A moment unlabeled. A pause too quiet to be kept in memory. Oren fluttered to her shoulder again. Lys didn't speak. She simply stood beneath the willow, letting the threads of the past drift around her like petals from a sky that remembered everything. And in her chest, something opened. A little wider. A little softer. The kind of opening that makes space for whatever comes next. The ninth evening arrived with a hush so complete it felt like the world had exhaled and forgotten to breathe back in. Even the sea was still, its surface glassy and slow, mirroring the silver sky above. No gulls cried. No wind wandered. In her small cottage, Liz lit her candle early. She had not planned to visit the shop again that night. Her mind was full, and her heart too quiet, but as the flame bloomed to life, it flickered in a direction her feet already understood. When she stepped into the shop, it welcomed her like the inside of a dream she hadn't known she'd been dreaming. The mirror stood waiting, but now its light pulsed softly, like the breath of something sleeping but aware. The garden beyond was still, its lanterns drifting lower, close to the silvery grass. But something new awaited her. From the heart of the mirror, a thin thread of light extended outward. It was a shimmering blue, like the edge of frost just before morning. It drifted, slowly, toward her, curling in the air like a ribbon carried on a thought. She reached out. The thread brushed her fingertips and wrapped gently around her wrist, not binding, only guiding. It tugged, with the gentlest invitation, and she followed it. She stepped forward. And for the first time, she stepped through. There was no sudden change, no flash, no noise. One moment she stood in the shop, the next, she was walking softly through the garden itself. Her feet made no sound. The air smelled of moonflowers and distant rain. The thread led her past the glass-dew flower, past the willow of memories, and into a grove she had never seen before. Trees with bark like velvet and leaves like breath surrounded her. The thread stopped before a stone, round and smooth, inscribed with only one word. Before. Oren fluttered down from a high branch, silent and radiant. The moth brushed its wings against the stone, and images bloomed around Liz like petals opening in reverse. She saw her mother, years younger, dancing barefoot on the shore, before sorrow softened her. She saw her father's hands shaping driftwood into toys, before silence settled over the house. She saw herself, not broken, not searching, but simply becoming. And she wept, not from pain, but from knowing. From seeing that before did not vanish. It lived quietly, waiting to be seen again. The thread of blue light curled once more, brushed her cheek, and faded into the sky. When she returned to the shop that night, the candle in her hand did not flicker. It glowed steady, as if the flame understood that the way forward required stillness, not speed. The mirror shimmered as she entered, its surface rippling once, then settling. The garden was quiet, and the sky above it held no stars, only a soft violet glow, like the moment just before dreams begin. Tonight, Oren waited beside something new. A door. It stood in the middle of a clearing, unconnected to any wall or building. It was simple in shape, arched like the mirror, framed in dark wood veined with silver. But there was no knob. No key. No handle. Just a single inscription, etched into the center. Only the open may enter. Liz stood before it, heart fluttering. She reached forward, then paused. What did it mean, to be open? Orin fluttered to the door and rested gently against it. The moth did not knock, did not press, merely waited. Lys took a breath. Not a deep one, not a brave one, just a true one. She thought of her fears, her doubts, the longing she carried like an old coin in her coat pocket. She thought of everything she had never said aloud, the ache of being misunderstood, the weight of silence, the quiet hope that she might matter, even in small and hidden ways. And she let them be. She didn't push them away, didn't try to fix them. She simply allowed them to sit beside her, like old friends who no longer needed to speak. And in that stillness, the door opened. No creak, no gust, just a gentle sigh, as though the world had allowed something to pass. On the other side, she saw not a room, but a sky. A sky made entirely of memory and promise, constellations shaped like whispered names, galaxies woven from hopes never spoken. The kind of sky one only sees in the moment between waking and sleep. Orin drifted through, wings aglow. And Lys followed. When Lys stepped through the door of no lock, she did not fall, nor fly. She drifted. The world beyond was not above or below but within, a place not built of earth or stone, but of quiet truths and forgotten music. The sky curved gently around her, not vast, but close, like a soft blanket pulled around the shoulders of the night. And in that sky, stars hung low enough to touch. But they were not stars in the way the world knew them. They were moments. Suspended in light, each one shimmered with a soft pulse, each one whispered its memory to the space around it. Lys reached out to the nearest. It was warm. And within it, she saw a child, no older than 6, gathering tiny moths into a cup made of leaves. The child laughed, a laugh so bright it rang like a bell in the hush. The moths flitted upward, unafraid, circling around the child's curls as if dancing to a silent lullaby. Lys blinked. It was her. A memory too long buried, too small to seem important. But here it shimmered like treasure. She touched another. Her mother, humming at the stove, sunlight painting golden dust across the floor. Her father, asleep in a chair, a carved toy resting unfinished in his lap. A garden in early spring, muddy knees, hands full of violets. Every memory, soft-edged and glimmering, spun gently in that sky. And Orin was there, weaving between them. The moth's wings left gentle trails of light, stitching memories together, not to bind, but to honor. To remind. To hold without gripping. And Lys, in the center of it all, realized something so small and so wide it filled her like quiet water. These were not just her memories. They were the gardens. The mirrors. Orin's. Each soul who had ever stood before the glass had left something behind. Not taken. Given. And the garden remembered them all. She did not know how long she stayed within the sky of memory. There was no time in that place. Only breath, only hush, only the slow unfolding of knowing. But when the moment came to return, she felt it in her chest, a soft tug, like the pull of tide on sand. Oren fluttered to her once more, and this time, the moth rested against her heart, its warmth like an ember that would never burn. And without a word, the garden folded itself back into light. The mirror shimmered. And Liz was standing once more in the little shop, beneath rafters of dreaming herbs, beside shelves of silent marvels. But she was no longer quite the same. The mirror still stood, but now its surface was calm, its glow gentle. Oren was nowhere to be seen, but she knew the moth was not gone. It was within her now. Not as a creature. Not even as a memory. But as a quiet understanding. She walked home slowly, candle in hand, fog curling around her ankles like an old friend. That night, Liz wrote in her journal. Not a question. A story. She wrote of the shop with no name. Of the mirror that blinked. Of the moth who bore a name made of hush. Of a garden filled with lanterns. Of a door that opened only for the open-hearted. And when she closed the book, she smiled. She would not try to explain it. Some things, like dreams, or music, or love, were not meant to be explained. Only remembered. And so, the mirror waited still, quiet and patient, for the next soul who would stop in the fog, and notice. And somewhere, just beyond the breath of the waking world, a moth with golden wings drifted through a garden of memory, waiting to open its wings, once more. In a town where rain has not fallen for 100 years. One quiet girl begins to paint silver clouds on broken walls. And when no one is looking, the sky begins to remember. There is a place beyond the edge of every map, where the sky leans down to kiss the sea, and time walks barefoot along the tide. In that place, each night when the stars awaken and the wind hushes its chatter, a single bell rings across the ocean. One note. No more. It is not loud. Not insistent. Not even certain. It hums gently through the air, like the final sigh of a lullaby, or the echo of something remembered in a dream. The sound drifts into fishing villages, slips past shutters and sails, and curls like mist into sleeping ears. Some say it is the sea herself, exhaling. Others say it is a ghost made of light and patience. In a little village pressed like a seashell against the coast, the bell is a comfort. It rings each night at the same moment, between twilight and true dark, and everyone hears it, though few speak of it. Except for one. A quiet girl named Mira. Mira was born on a night when the stars were shy, and the sea was still. The bell rang as she opened her eyes for the first time, and some said that was why her gaze was always tilted toward distant things. She grew slowly, like moss on stone, gentle, steady, unnoticed by many but deeply rooted in the world. She lived in a small cottage by the shore with her grandfather, a retired sailor with hands like driftwood and a voice that sounded like waves rolling in sleep. He had once sailed beyond the edge of the known waters, but he never spoke of what he saw. Only once, when Mira was very small, had he whispered, "Some things wait in the sea not to be found, but to be followed." Each night, she would sit on the stones near the tide's reach, knees drawn to her chest, and wait for the note. It always came. And when it did, She closed her eyes and listened, not just with her ears, but with her whole being, as if the sound were something meant for her. Then, one night, just after the bell's gentle chime echoed through the stillness, the tide left something on the shore. It was a piece of driftwood, pale and polished, no longer than her forearm. Carved into it were 5 simple words. "The bell is waiting, Mira." Mira held the driftwood close to her chest for a long time, the sea wind tugging gently at her hair, the stars blinking overhead like curious thoughts. She did not run, nor cry out. She simply stood in the hush of it all, as the waves whispered around her ankles and the tide began to fall away again, carrying no further signs, no footprints, no instructions. Just the message. The bell is waiting. By morning, the tide had given her more. A glass bottle, green and clouded by salt, had nestled itself between 2 smooth rocks below her window. She found it just as the sun slid over the horizon, painting the world in the faintest gold. Within the bottle, sealed with wax and worn by water, was a slip of paper curled like a sleeping shell. It took time and care to draw it out, but when she did, Mira found a map, though not one she could easily understand. There were no names. No mountains. No villages. No X to mark a place. Only lines that curved like breath. Waves drawn in spirals. Dots that shimmered faintly in certain light, and wind symbols that seemed to shift position when she turned the page. And in the center, written in ink so pale it almost wasn't there. Follow what listens. The bell will answer. She showed it to no one. Not because she feared they wouldn't believe her, but because she didn't want the magic to thin under too many eyes. That evening, she stood again where sea met land, holding the bottle in one hand, the driftwood in the other. The stars began to bloom. The waves hushed. And then, as always, the bell rang. But this time, it felt closer. Not louder. Not clearer. Just nearer, like the sea had leaned forward a little, waiting to see what she might do. Mira closed her eyes. The moment had arrived. She knew it in her bones, in the salt behind her teeth, in the quiet lapping of the water against her ankles. She would follow. Not to chase the bell. Not to catch it. But to walk where it led. The next morning, Mira rose before the sun. The village still slept, chimney tops quiet, fishing nets still hung in their places like empty spiderwebs. Her grandfather had left a cup of warm tea on the windowsill, just as he always did, and beside it, a single word written on a folded slip of parchment. Go. Nothing more. But it was enough. She packed lightly, a satchel with dried sea bread, a woolen wrap, her journal, the driftwood message, and the strange, shifting map. She took no compass, only a small bell her grandfather had once given her, shaped like a seashell, silent unless held to the heart. And then she walked. Not along roads, for there were none leading where she was meant to go. She followed the shore, where the water reached and fell, step by step beside the sleeping sea. With each wave that whispered at her heels, she imagined the bell's note lingering, just beneath the surface. The tide drew lower as the hours passed, revealing a path of stone and glimmering sand that had not been there the day before. It stretched like a ribbon of thought, winding far out into the sea, leading nowhere, yet undeniably somewhere. Seabirds circled silently above her. The wind grew hushed. The sky brightened but never burned. It was as if the day knew to be gentle, to not break the spell. At last, when the land behind her had faded into mist, and even her footprints had been swallowed by the ocean's breath, Mira came upon the first sign. A cairn, tall and narrow, made of smooth stones stacked in perfect balance. Resting atop it was a single object, a small piece of shell, polished white and shaped like a crescent moon. As she reached for it, the shell gave off a faint chime, clear, high, and familiar. The bell's note. But this one was hers. And for the first time, Mira smiled. The path ahead was not empty. It was singing. The light bent softly into the sea, turning every ripple gold, then silver, then finally blue. Mira had followed the stone path until it vanished beneath the waves once more, then stepped into the water where it disappeared. But instead of deepening, the sea grew shallower, as though folding itself beneath her feet. And just as the sun fell behind the horizon, she saw it. An island. But not in the usual sense. It floated in the haze like a memory not yet fully formed. Its shape was uncertain, soft edges, no hard lines, more suggestion than land. Trees shimmered like they were being dreamed into existence, and flowers bloomed in clusters that hummed with a gentle glow. There were no sounds of birds or insects, only the low, ever-present hush of something remembering itself. Mira stepped onto the shore. Her feet did not sink. The sand was firm and cool, though her footprints vanished behind her instantly. She followed a winding trail made not of dirt, but of light, a pale, quiet path that pulsed with the same rhythm as the bell's note. Soon, she reached the center of the island, where a pool lay so still it mirrored not only the sky but her own breath. In the middle of the pool stood a pedestal made of driftwood and coral. And upon it rested another shell, this one the size of her palm, etched with delicate, spiraling lines. She touched it. And the bell rang again. But this time, it rang not in her ears, but through her fingers, her chest, her mind. It echoed softly in her bones, reminding her of lullabies her mother used to hum, the hush of stormy nights long past, and a name she had once whispered to herself when afraid in the dark. The shell pulsed with a soft glow, then dimmed. Mira took it, placing it beside the first in her satchel. She did not know why she needed them. Only that they were part of what she was meant to gather. As she sat beside the pool, stars above and stars below, she whispered aloud. "Where are you, Belle?" And for a moment, just one breath of time, the island itself seemed to sigh. As if it, too, was listening. Mira awoke in the twilight, though she had not remembered falling asleep. The sky was still soft with stars, the breeze carried the scent of salt and something faintly sweet, like the breath of sleeping lilies. The pool beside her still mirrored the sky, still shimmered with its quiet stillness. But now, someone sat across from her. Not a person in the usual sense. Not quite human, not quite creature. The figure was shaped of driftwood and seaweed, gently glowing with the pale green of deep water. Its eyes were smooth shells, and its voice, when it finally spoke, was like a tide drawing back into itself. "You carry the sound," it said. "But not the weight." Mira sat up, heart calm but curious. She didn't speak. She had learned, by now, that silence was its own form of listening. The figure, the keeper, she thought to call it, rose and held out a hand made of braided kelp. In its palm lay three things: a fragment of clouded glass, a bead made from the spine of a shell, and a ribbon so translucent it might have been made of wind. "These are pieces of what remains," the keeper murmured. "Of the bell. Of its memory. It has rung each night not to warn, not to summon, but to remember. Something was lost. And it remembers." Mira reached out, gently taking the ribbon first. It fluttered in her grasp without wind, wrapping softly around her wrist. The keeper nodded. "Now it knows you're listening." With that, the figure began to fade, unraveling like mist at sunrise, the glass bead and fragment left behind in Myra's hands. She tucked them away with care, her satchel now holding three tokens, each humming with their own kind of quiet. She stood, the path of light glowing once more at her feet. And far across the still sea, she heard it. Faint, clear, and close. The bell. But this time, it rang twice. Not across waves or wind, but through a place where the sea no longer moved. The water here was smooth as silk, not even a ripple from her presence. Her boat, if it could be called that, was a simple raft of driftwood, waiting for her at the island's edge as though it had always known she would come. When she stepped aboard, it glided forward without paddle or sail, carried by a current made of memory. Above her, the sky shimmered with stars, each pulsing faintly, not with light, but with music. There were constellations shaped like sleeping birds, like coiled ropes, like open hands. And somewhere behind them, she thought she could hear a melody, slow, low, almost like a hum. The sea beneath her showed reflections not of the sky, but of moments. A woman humming a lullaby while washing stones. A man carving a bell from coral with hands that trembled. Children laughing near tidipools, unaware that the ocean listened. These were not her memories, but she felt them all the same. The water remembered what the world had forgotten. And the bell, it seemed, had been left behind to hold it all, softly, gently, without demand. After some time, or perhaps no time at all, the raft slowed. Before her rose another island, smaller than the last, shaped like a resting hand. Upon its shore stood a single figure, an old woman wrapped in nets and pearls, her hair like storm clouds, her eyes like dusk. "I've been ringing it," she said softly, even before Mira stepped onto the sand. "For as long as I could." Mira opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She didn't need them. The woman smiled, a slow, tender thing, and looked toward the center of the island, where something shimmered just beyond sight. "It's time for you to see it," she said. And Mira followed. The old woman led Mira down a path of crushed shells and worn stone, beneath arching boughs of silver-leaf trees. The island was small, only as wide as a whisper, and yet it felt vast, as though it held more than its shape should allow. With each step, the air grew quieter, the stars above dimming slightly, as if bowing their heads. And then they reached it. The bell. It stood in a grove at the island's center, rooted to the earth not by iron or rope, but by vines and coral that wound lovingly around its base. It was tall, slender, shaped not like a tower bell or temple chime, but like a teardrop made of moonlight and sound. It shimmered, not with metal, but with memory. Its surface was etched with 1,000 tiny markings, waves, spirals, starbursts, and names. So many names. Mira could not read them all, but as her fingers brushed the bell's side, she felt them sing. Each name a note. Each life a chime that had once echoed into the sea. It does not ring to be heard, the old woman said, her voice no louder than a breath. It rings to remember. Mira looked at her. All this time, she whispered, it's been holding the stories no one could carry. The woman nodded. When the world forgets, the bell remembers. But it is growing tired. The sea is full. And memory is heavy. Mira stepped closer. The bell shimmered once, softly. And then, from her satchel, the pieces she'd gathered began to stir. The ribbon of wind, the glass shard, the shell bead. One by one, they lifted into the air, glowing faintly. They drifted to the bell and nested gently into hollows carved just for them. The bell pulsed once. Then again. And then, it fell silent. Not empty. Not gone. Only, resting. The old woman turned to Mira, her eyes like waves just before sleep. It knows you now, she said. It may ring again, when it is ready. That night, Mira sat beside the bell beneath a sky now darker than she'd ever seen. The stars were gone. Not hidden, gone. And yet, the darkness was not frightening. It wrapped around her like a weighted blanket, grounding her in the moment. A darkness filled not with emptiness, but with meaning waiting to be felt. The old woman had left her there without farewell. No instructions. No warnings. Only a small glance, soft as dusk, and a nod that said, "This is yours now." Mira placed her satchel beside her and closed her eyes. There was no sound, not even the breath of the wind. And then, gently, faintly, she began to hum. Not a song she had learned. Not one she had heard. But something that rose from deep inside her, a melody shaped by the sea, the memory, the waiting. And the bell listened. Though it made no sound, she felt it, warm and alive beside her. She sang of the village, of her grandfather's stories, of the tide's hush and the feeling of never quite knowing where one belonged. She sang of footsteps across forgotten paths, of shells filled with echoes, of messages carried in salt. She sang until her voice faded into breath. And then she rested. When dawn came, it came slowly, first as a soft glow behind her closed eyelids, then as warmth across her cheek, then as the hush of waves waking up. She opened her eyes. The stars had returned. And beside her, the bell glowed faintly, as if smiling. The sun rose with a hush, as though it too feared to disturb the silence the bell had made. Mira stood slowly, brushing the sleep from her eyes, the dream still lingering in her chest like a shell-cradling sound. She walked beyond the bell, through the grove that had grown in its shadow. There, she found something she had not noticed before. A tree. Not tall. Not wide. But entirely silver, its bark smooth like driftwood, its leaves like slivers of frost. It stood alone in a circle of soft sand, and at its base, 100 small objects lay arranged like offerings. Shells. Letters. Pieces of broken instruments. Drawings faded by salt. Every one of them held something left behind, a story, a wish, a goodbye. As Mira stepped closer, the tree stirred. Its leaves began to tremble, not in wind, but in music. The sound was faint, not a melody but a memory of one, as if each leaf whispered a different note of an old song. And when Mira knelt beside the roots, she saw her own reflection in the silver bark, not just her face, but all the moments she had gathered. The first time she heard the bell. The look in her grandfather's eyes when he handed her the map. The hush of the sea as it led her forward. The old woman's voice, worn smooth by years of waiting. The hum of the shell in her hand. She placed her satchel at the base of the tree. All the objects she had carried, ribbons, shells, fragments, settled into the sand like puzzle pieces returning to the whole. And as she rose again, the leaves above her shimmered. The tree had accepted them. And in doing so, it remembered. A soft wind stirred. Not from the sea. From within the island. The kind of wind that wakes only when something has been forgiven. That night, as twilight braided itself through the air, Mira sat beneath the tree. The stars blinked open, slowly, one by one, like memories too tender to appear all at once. The bell stood quiet in its grove, content. It no longer needed to call, because she had come. But Mira knew, there was still one sound left to be heard. And it would not come from the bell alone. She stood and walked back to it. Its surface, once shimmering, now glowed faintly with warmth, as though her touch had left a mark not of pressure, but of presence. She reached into her coat and pulled out the small bell her grandfather had given her long ago, the one shaped like a seashell. She had never heard it ring. Not until now. She held it to her chest, and for the first time, gave it voice. It was soft. Tender. A single chime. But it echoed, not through air, but through water, through memory, through every shell she had ever pressed to her ear. And the great bell beside her answered. It rang, not with sorrow, not with longing, but with peace. The note was clear and wide, and yet so gentle it barely touched the air. It felt instead, like a breath on the soul, like a hand resting gently on a weary shoulder. The two bells, small and great, sang together once, and the island seemed to exhale. And then silence. But not the kind that comes from absence. The kind that follows something sacred. Mira stood there a long while, her heart full, her eyes damp, not from sadness, but from fullness. The sea had been carrying the note all this time. Not as a call, but as a cradle. Mira remained on the island until the sky softened into pearl, until even the moon looked weary from listening. She had no need to rush. The bell would ring no more for her. It had told its story. Now it would rest. She stood once more beneath the memory tree. The leaves no longer shimmered, they simply swayed, slow and sure, as if breathing. The silver bark felt warm beneath her fingers. She pressed her palm to it and whispered a word of thanks, not for what had been given, but for what had been kept. Then, turning, she followed the path back across the sea. The raft was waiting. The stars made way. And the sea, now awake but gentle, bore her home. It took longer than she remembered. But the slowness was welcome. The kind of slowness that comes with understanding, when time no longer presses, but drifts. As she neared her village, dawn lit the rooftops like gold thread sewn into the edges of dreams. The chimneys breathed morning. The gulls returned to their sky. And the people, they slept. She stepped off the raft onto familiar sand. Her footprints marked the shore once more. She walked back to the cottage, her satchel light now, her hands empty but her heart filled with something too deep for names. And on the windowsill, as though it had never left, was a fresh cup of tea. Still warm. She smiled, stepped inside, and sat at the small table where her grandfather once carved stories from wood and silence. He was gone now. But she could hear him in the hush. The bell never rang again. Not in the way it had before. The villagers noticed, of course, though few spoke of it. Some said the wind had shifted. Others thought the tide had swallowed the sound. But Mira knew. The bell had passed on its song. And though it no longer echoed across the sea, it had not vanished. It had simply moved, to quieter places. To the lullabies of mothers rocking newborns beneath lantern glow. To the hush of waves smoothing old stones. To the silence before a question is asked, or after a name is remembered. And inside Mira. Not as a sound, but as a knowing. She never told the full story. Not to anyone. But children would sit near her door in the evenings, listening to the sea and hoping to hear just one faint note. And she would smile, sip her tea, and hum softly to herself. Years passed. Seasons changed like breath. And one night, far across the sea, on a new island that hadn't existed before, the bells sang once more. Just once. Not for all. Only for one. A child with questions in their heart and silence in their steps. And so the story began again, not the same, never quite, but with the same hush, the same call, the same invitation. Come. Listen. The bell is waiting. In a forgotten orchard where fruit holds forgotten time. An old clockmaker tastes a moment he lost long ago. And with each bite, the past blooms gently once more. In the town of Doria, the sky had not wept in 100 years. Not once had the clouds gathered in softness. Not once had the rooftops felt the music of falling drops. The wells sank deep, the air stood still, and the people grew used to the dryness, so used to it, in fact, that they no longer wished for rain. It was easier, they said, not to hope for things that did not come. The days passed slowly. Pale light settled over the streets like dust, and shadows slept in doorways. The trees did not grow, but leaned inward. The rivers did not flow, but lay quiet beneath stone. And the sky, vast and unchanging, stretched on and on above it all, blank and endless, like silence painted blue. In a quiet house at the edge of the market square, there lived a girl named Senna. She was not loud. She did not run or shout or spin. She walked like thought and breathed like hush. Her mother wove baskets, her fingers quick and tired. Her father had once been a storyteller, a whisperer of skies and wind dances, but he had passed long ago, and with him, most of the town's memories of rain had gone too. Senna, however, remembered. She did not remember with words or facts, but with feeling. A soft ache when she looked up at the sky. A longing she could not name. And so, she painted. She painted with crushed berry dye, and soot, and pigment mixed from sage and ash. She painted small circles and gentle lines, soft gray arcs across broken walls, faded cloth, and crumbling brick. Her favorite shape was that of falling rain, long, silvery trails descending from clouds she imagined overhead. No one paid her much mind. People passed her with kind but quiet smiles. "That's the girl who paints skydrops," they would say. "She remembers water." And Senna would nod. But she kept painting. And one morning, just before sunrise, she painted a storm cloud on the side of the old cistern, a soft, swirling thing, with little streaks of silver trailing down. She stepped back, pressed her palms together, and turned away. Behind her, unseen, the paint shimmered in the dim morning air. The bricks beneath it darkened slightly. And for a moment, just one breath of time, the wind carried something forgotten across the square. The scent of rain. Senna noticed it first in the silence. The hush of the town was always still, always slow, but this was different. This silence waited. It leaned forward. It listened. She stepped outside and stood beneath the picture she had painted. The sky above was the same, wide, pale, without a cloud in sight. The air held its breath. Even the dust refused to stir. She looked down. The stone at her feet was damp. Not soaked. Not splashed. Just softened. As if a single drop had fallen and dared to linger. Her breath caught, and for the first time in her life, she wondered if her painting had whispered something the world had not heard in a long, long time. The villagers noticed, too. Children, passing by, touched the stone and looked up. Shopkeepers paused, wiping flour from their hands, blinking toward the old cistern wall. And an elder, wrapped in dry linens, bent low, pressed his fingers to the damp, and whispered, "No dew falls in summer." That night, Senna returned to the wall. She brought her paints, blackberry pulp and ash, crushed stone, and a brush carved from a reed. With slow, sure strokes, she painted again. A single drop, long and thin, falling from the edge of the cloud. As she worked, the air grew cool. By the time the last line was drawn, the entire alley behind her had hushed. And when she stepped back, the wind moved. It stirred the hem of her tunic. It danced against her cheeks. It smelled not of earth or sun or dust, but of something older, cleaner, clearer. Rain. Only a hint. A breath. But it was there. Senna didn't smile. Not yet. She only closed her eyes, placed a hand on the stone wall, and whispered 3 words not spoken aloud in Doria for a century. Come back, rain. And though the sky gave no answer, and the clouds did not form, something in the stillness shifted. The silence, it seemed, was listening. The old cistern wall became her canvas. Each morning, Senna returned with her paints, quiet jars of color born from ash and herb, from berry and bark. She worked in silence, painting lines that curled like wind and drops that lingered like sighs. And the wall changed. Not all at once. Not loudly. But where her brush had touched, the bricks grew darker. The air around them cooled. And each time she finished a piece, the silence that followed was deeper, not empty, but listening. The townspeople began to gather. First, the children. Then the shopkeepers. Then the elders who rarely left their doorways. They said nothing. Only watched. Their eyes were cautious, the way one looks at a dream they don't dare believe in. A week passed. Then another. And the wall bloomed. Senna had painted storms, soft ones, shaped like swirls and petals. She had painted rivers that wrapped around themselves like stories. She had painted leaves falling through drizzle, clouds touching mountaintops, and windows fogged with breath. And still, no rain. But the town had begun to change. The baskets her mother wove began to creak in the night, as if shrinking from damp. The air in the baker's shop grew cool enough to keep bread soft until dusk. And one morning, on the smooth stones beneath the wall, the faintest footprints appeared, bare and wet, as though someone had walked through puddles that hadn't yet formed. Senna said nothing. She only kept painting. The wall became known as the Wall of Quiet Things. It never shouted. It never asked. It simply stood, a page of sky drawn in stone, remembering what had been forgotten. And somewhere, just beyond the hills, clouds began to gather. They did not come fast. They did not come bold. But they came. One evening, as the sky turned the color of cooled clay, Senna's brush broke. It snapped not from force, but from use, its reed worn thin, its bristles gone soft and tired. She held the pieces in her hands, small and fragile, and for the first time, she felt the weight of all she had asked of her art. She had painted every day. 4 weeks. For the sky. For the people. For the silence. She sat beside the wall, watching her work stretch across the stone. Some of it had begun to fade, soaked softly into the bricks. The storm clouds still shimmered, but the drops looked ready to fall. And still, the sky held. Clear. Open. Empty. Senna rested her head against the wall. "I don't know what more to give," she whispered. The wind, which had always been gentle, stirred her hair and then settled. That night, she dreamt. In her dream, she stood beneath a sky that was weeping. Rain fell in ribbons, soft and endless. Around her feet bloomed flowers of every color she had never used. Beside her stood a figure with no face, only light. It held out a brush, twisted wood, bristles made from something like mist. When she reached for it, she woke. And in her room, upon her windowsill, was a reed brush. New. Untouched. Bound in silver thread. She didn't question it. Some gifts are not meant to be explained. She gathered her paints, rose before dawn, and walked barefoot to the wall. The earth beneath her was cool, and her footprints left faint marks on the stone path. And this time, as she painted, the clouds watched. The first stroke of her new brush was unlike any Senna had ever made. The line it left on the wall shimmered, not brightly, not with glitter or shine, but with depth. It was soft, like velvet shadow, and carried within it a color she could not name. Not gray, not blue, not silver. It was the color of longing, of held breath, of water before it falls. She painted slowly, each movement guided not by thought, but by something deeper, something ancient and sleeping just beneath her ribs. The townspeople gathered again, drawn by the quiet that grew around her work. They did not speak, but some brought things to leave at the base of the wall, a folded letter, a flower pressed in cloth, a child's smooth stone. Offerings, perhaps. Or hopes. Senna painted a river that wound through a forest no one had seen. She painted a puddle that reflected a forgotten sky. And then, she painted a single raindrop, larger than any before, suspended in the air just before falling. When she stepped back, the crowd behind her exhaled. Not loudly. Not in wonder. In recognition. For they all felt it, as if the sky above had shifted. And then, the first sound. A single drip. It landed on the ground before the wall. No one saw from where. The sky was still dry. But the stone darkened where it fell. Senna looked up. The clouds were there now. Still distant. Still unsure. But they had remembered the way. That night, the town of Doria stayed awake. No one said why. No one planned it. But none could sleep, not while the air held the weight it hadn't worn in 100 years. The sky was not yet raining. But it thought of rain. The children sat on rooftops, eyes wide with wonder. Elders placed bowls outside, just in case. Cats curled up beneath eaves, waiting. And in the center of it all, Senna stood before the wall of quiet things, her brush held close, her paint spread like offerings across stone. She painted not quickly, but with patience. Each line was a word unspoken. Each drop was a memory stitched from stories she barely remembered. A new cloud had formed above her home, low and round and heavy. But it did not release. It hovered, watching. Senna looked up at it. "I remember you," she whispered. And for just a moment, the cloud dipped lower, as if bowing. She painted through the night. One great scene, an arching sky stitched with storm, a stream trickling down stone steps, a window fogged with breath and laughter. And as dawn approached, the air changed. It cooled. It moved. And a scent bloomed through the town, soft and clean and holy. The scent of coming rain. And everyone felt it at once, not in their skin, but in their hearts. They did not cheer. They did not speak. They only looked up, and listened. For the sound of what they had long forgotten. It did not begin with thunder. There was no lightning. No sudden gusts. No flood rushing down the hills. It began with a single sound. Tap. Then another. Tap. Tap. A drop landed on Senna's shoulder. She looked up, her face calm, unstartled, and a second drop kissed her cheek, trailing down like a tear not her own. Around her, the townspeople stilled. One by one, they lifted their hands, their eyes, their open palms. And it rained. Softly. Gently. The way sleep arrives when no one is watching. Like a song that has waited a long, long time to be sung. The wall darkened as water soaked into the painted clouds, blending the lines, deepening the shapes, making the images ripple with life. The streets glistened. The rooftops shimmered. The dry earth drank in the sound of falling water with joy too quiet for words. Some wept. Not from sadness. Not from surprise. But from the ache of remembering what it means to be touched by the sky. Senna did not weep. She stood very still, the rain trailing down her arms, her brush falling to her side. She watched the drops hit the ground, one by one, watched them fill the cracks between stones like silver threads in a tapestry. And she whispered, very softly, "Thank you." For the first time in a century, the wind carried not dust, but mist. The rain lasted only 10 minutes. But when it ended, the town had changed. Not in structure, walls still stood, trees still leaned, and the market still rustled with morning stirrings. But in spirit, something had shifted. There was laughter again. Low and sudden, like a hiccup of happiness. There were hands reaching out to feel puddles. There were songs being hummed, very quietly, under breath. And in the center of it all stood the wall, wet now, its colors deeper, its drops seeming to fall in motion. The rain had not washed the paint away. It had finished it. Senna returned to it with her brush, but found she could not paint. Not because her hand had lost its art, but because the wall no longer asked for anything. It was complete. The people gathered and asked her gently, "Will you paint more?" She nodded. But not here. She walked through the village with her brush tucked into her sash, and wherever she stopped, an old door, a cracked pot, a dry window, she painted. A single drop. a curling cloud, a stream winding across brick. And wherever she painted, the rain followed. Not always right away. Not always much. But enough. Enough to remind the world that the sky had not forgotten how to weep. It had simply waited for someone to ask with love. Senna never asked for thanks. She simply listened. And painted. Beyond the edge of the village, where the stones grew older and the paths gave way to dust, there stood a house with no roof. It had been abandoned long ago. The walls still held, worn but unbroken, and a single tree had grown up through its floor, tall, leafless, and gray as bone. No one lived there. No one walked that far. It was a place of endings, and endings were not something Doria liked to look at. But one morning, just after the fourth rain, Senna went there. She carried no basket. No brush. Only her fingers. She stood inside the roofless house beneath the tree and looked up. The sky blinked through the branches, blue and open, and now, at last, alive. Senna pressed her fingers into the dust and drew a line. Then another. Then a swirl that curved like a cloud and blossomed into a rain-spattered shape across the broken wall. She painted with mud and memory. The tree seemed to listen. And when she finished, she sat down in the center of the space and placed her hand against the earth. Not to call the rain. Just to feel. The clouds gathered quickly. This time, the drops came stronger. Fuller. As though the sky had gained confidence. As though it had learned not only how to cry, but how to dance. Rain fell through the missing roof in wide arcs, soaking the dust, slicking the bark, tracing her artwork into motion. And for the first time in that forgotten place, the tree began to sprout leaves. Tiny ones. Silver green. Soft as breath. And in town, when the villagers saw the storm gathering above the old ruin, they did not worry. They walked to their windows. They stood under porches. And they smiled. Senna no longer needed to ask the rain. She had become its invitation. The clouds followed her gently, not to flood, not to overwhelm, but to bless. To linger in the soft spaces she painted. To offer a sigh to every thirsty place she touched. Her brush now lived tucked in a loop on her belt, and her fingers bore the stains of earth and ash and crushed flower. She painted not just on walls, but on stones, on clay jars, on fabric draped across balconies. Each painting carried a promise. A stream on a doorway. A puddle on a stair. A drop on a child's hand. And each time the sky kept the promise. But with every rainfall, Senna grew quieter. Not sad. Just still. She began to dream in shapes and rhythms, in wet colors and rippling lines. In her sleep, the clouds spoke, not with words, but with weight, with silence, with falling. They showed her other places, far from Doria. Dry hills. Empty rivers. Silent towns. Places still waiting. And when she woke, she felt it in her chest, that pull, soft and slow, like water seeping through stone. The wall was finished. The village was full. And she was meant to go on. Senna waited until the next dawn. The village lay wrapped in mist, the streets glistening from last night's rain. The wells were full. The fields had darkened to a richer brown. Flowers bloomed on windowsills where none had grown for years, and birds, real birds, had returned to the roofs. She stood before the wall of quiet things one last time. The paint had faded into the stone now, softened by the rains, but it had not vanished. The clouds and rivers and silver lines still shimmered in the right light, no longer needing to be seen, only remembered. The townsfolk came silently. They did not ask her to stay. They only brought her small gifts, a satchel stitched by hand, a folded shawl dyed in rainwater, a tiny bell tied with grass thread. She accepted them with a bow, her hands pressed in thanks. Then she stepped to the wall. And with her brush, she painted one final image. A door. Just a simple, wooden door, half open, with a sky behind it full of falling rain. No one asked what it meant. But everyone understood. She turned from the wall, kissed her mother's hands, and walked from the square, barefoot, as she had begun. The clouds followed. Not with thunder. Not with storm. With presence. And the sky, above the whole town of Doria, wept softly, not for sorrow, but for beauty that had been returned. Senna never returned to the village. But her paintings did. On the wings of travelers. On the folds of cloth brought in from far markets. On the stories whispered by those who had once seen her work shimmer with memory. They called her the Rain Girl. The quiet brush. The one who asked kindly. And far away, across hills and deserts and towns still wrapped in silence, people began to find shapes on their walls they did not remember painting. A single raindrop. A gentle cloud. A stream winding across stone. And afterward, the scent. The hush. The rain. Senna walked alone, but never lonely. She painted not for fame, not for answers, but for the sky, and for the earth that longed to be touched by it. And wherever she stopped, the rain came. Not always quickly. Not always in full. But enough. Enough to remind the world that rain is not just water. It is remembering. It is forgiveness. It is love falling from above. And somewhere still, under another sky, a quiet girl walks with a brush in her hand, and a storm tucked gently in her heart. Not to bring chaos, but to teach the clouds how to listen.